What's important to understand, though, is that percentages do not give you anything about the real number.
An increasing or decreasing percentage does not mean an increasing or decreasing amount.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 7Sage LSAT Podcast. My name is Henry, and I'm joined with my co-host,
Aastha and Henry. I am sick today, listeners of the podcast, so I'm sorry you have to hear me like this, but the show must go on. The
think
podcast
about how we
stops
feel.
For no one.
You know,
Whatever.
sorry. I feel terrible.
Henry, what are we what are we talking about today other than my strep throat?
On today's doc, we're going to talk a little bit about some basic economic principles that appear on this test. And that is, I think, are pretty good to familiarize yourself. And we're also going to be doing a quick overview of proportions. A lot of people end up struggling with proportions on this test because, I mean, you know, it's not a math test. You don't have to be great at math, but there are some mathematical concepts that are, expected that you understand. In particular, dealing with percentages, proportions, and whatnot.
I wanna preface this by saying that, you know, we say a lot on this podcast, and you'll hear generally about the LSAT that you don't need to have any background knowledge, or you shouldn't come into this test with any background information. That's still true, right? What we're going to talk about today when it comes to economics or math, all these different concepts, they are not things that you need to be an expert on, but they can make approaching certain types of questions a lot easier and a lot more efficient. You can get through a lot of these questions about proportions or supply or demand or whatever. You can get through them. It'll just take quite a bit of time. But if you already have these concepts familiar, you've practiced them, you feel really comfortable with kind of rudimentary numbers and proportions, your life will be a lot smoother. So I don't want to go into this episode thinking if you're not really good at math and you haven't done Calc 3, you're not going to be good at the LSAT. That's not true. But these things are tools that you can use as you're approaching some of these questions.
Yeah, fun fact. I dropped out of Calc 3 when I was
Why
I was
were you
planning on being a
taking
math
Calc
major.
3? Oh, okay.
I was planning on being a math major. Just to bounce off of that though, just going on your idea about how there's not outside knowledge is not a requirement per se. The alien example gets often brought up, right? Imagine you're an alien coming down to Earth and you just don't really know anything.
You did this to me last episode. I was like, what are you talking about? I don't know if you saw the final cut.
Is this not? So, did I hallucinate that this is an explanation? A common explanation?
On the curriculum?
That was my understanding. Yeah, on the core curriculum, or maybe it's in some other book.
I had not heard it before, on 7Sage. Personally. But you said it last episode. I was like, what could you possibly... Why are we talking about aliens right now? But your point makes sense. Continue.
Yeah. The idea of, imagining you're an alien, the reason we say that is because you want to... You don't want to come in with as little assumptions, right? And where do assumptions come from? It's just your lived experience, right? So you're assuming X, Y, and Z just because that's how it works in the real world, but it might not be logically consistent. And so the idea is you inhabit, imagine you're an alien coming down to Earth and you don't know anything. You should, in theory, be able to do pretty well on this test. However, just because it's not a requirement, it does not mean it's not useful. Nothing on this test ends up going against reality. Right? For example, in reading comprehension, all of the RC passages are like real in a sense, right? They're not fabricated. They are things that happened. They're not going to invent some event that occurred in the past just to write an RC passage about it. It's about actual events. Similarly, the economic concepts on this test are real, and they're not going to contradict each other. The math on this test is real, and so the more familiar you are with math, the more familiar you are with economics, the more familiar you are with history. And I really think like history is such a powerful one with RC. The easier time you're going to have on this test. With that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about what you are expected to know. Right? You are expected to have an understanding of percentages, right? Percentages and fractions and proportions in particular.
Yeah.
So let's go down with percentages, right? Why are percentages very tricky? What is a percentage? How would you describe a percentage?
What is a percentage? I guess a ratio, right? What proportion of things from one group to the next?
Yeah, I actually don't know. I tossed it back to you because I was... right?
Well, I think that's correct, right? A
fraction,
percentage,
right? Yeah, percentage.
What portion of something is of another group.
Yeah, right. It's the ratio of something. The percentage of people who are Asian in this room, that's undeniable, right? It's
Okay.
whatever. The percentage of people are, it's the number of Asians divided by the number of people in the room, right? And so what you're looking for is it's a relationship, right? It's a relationship between a certain group versus the entirety of that group, right? So the percentage of people who vote, right, in America, right? So what that is a relationship between the number of people who vote versus the number of people that actually live in America. And so when you're thinking about percentages, what it's saying effectively is, if I say, 50% of people like to buy coffee. Well, what does that mean? That half of people like to buy coffee. What's important to understand, though, is that percentages do not give you anything about the real number, right? So percentages
Absolutely.
can never inform you about the real number. If I say, hey, look, 50% of people in America like to buy coffee, 20% of people in South Africa like to buy ice cream.
Sure.
Sure. Now, of course, I'm going against my real life analysis here. But you don't actually know if the number of people who like to buy coffee in America is greater than the number of people who like to buy ice cream in South America or South Africa. Did I go with Africa or America?
You went Africa, yeah.
South Africa. The issue is so sure, there's a higher percentage of people in America versus a higher percentage of people in South Africa. But the issue is we don't know how many people live in South Africa. We don't know how many people live in America. So how they are going to try and get this they're going to try and burn you on this test by getting you to make that assumption that a larger percentage necessarily indicates a larger number, right? So in the past, 100% of people hunted for food.
Oh, sure.
100% of people hunted, right, for food. I don't know if it's 100%, right? But imagine in the Stone Ages, people would hunt. There wasn't any of this farming stuff going on, right? And now, by comparison, a much smaller percentage of people hunt today. Have you ever hunted?
No. God, no. I'd be really bad at it, probably.
Yeah, only LSAT problems, right? Only LSAT problems. Right? So there's a much smaller percentage of hunters today, right? You would reckon that. However, it could be that there's a lot more hunters today than there ever were. So, because even though there's a smaller percentage of hunters in the world today, there's a much larger number of people. And so when you're looking at percentages on this test, a good thing you can take a quick pause on is asking yourself, well, wait, hey, they're talking about percentages. I know that they like to spring traps on me when it comes to percentages. So whenever you see a percentage, remind yourself that you don't know the actual size. You don't know the actual number. How is this relevant today? Right, so we have a larger percentage of wind farm and solar energy and a decreasing percentage of fossil fuels. So one might assume that, wow, we are doing a great thing here. We're burning so much less fossil fuels. But in fact, the opposite is true. Even though we have a decreasing percentage of fossil fuels being burned, we actually have an increasing amount of carbon going into the atmosphere. And it's true of America right now, right? So the idea here is that it's very deceptive, right? You'll hear, oh, man, we have a decreasing percentage of fossil fuels. And aren't we doing so good? Well, we actually aren't doing good. We're doing worse. Even though we are lowering our percentage, we're still increasing the number of fossil fuels that we pump into the atmosphere every day. So just to make it a little more relevant to you today, something that in real life, I love bringing in real life examples.
I love it. I mean, I think the biggest thing that you're pointing out here that feels very simple when we're just talking about it, but when you're looking at an LR question, it's very tricky, especially on a time crunch, is that an increasing or decreasing percentage does not mean an increasing or decreasing amount, right? Things can go up in percentage and go down in the total amount, or vice versa. Just like you were saying, we can have a lower amount of a lower percentage amount of fossil fuels. That doesn't mean the amount of fossil fuels aren't still going up. And especially when you're comparing those two things, it can get really, really tricky to keep straight. So like Henry said, whenever you're doing, especially an LR question, if you're seeing a percentage come up, especially comparison between percentages, you have to be very, very careful to make sure you're not confusing amount with proportion, because those are two completely different things. And it's something that I have a lot of students come to me asking, like, can you find me a list of LR questions that have numbers in them? And this is usually the reason they're asking, right? Because they're getting tripped up on these types of proportions. Henry, there was a question we were talking about before we were starting to record about unemployment rates. Could you walk us through that example and just kind of tell us what tends to be confusing about it?
Yeah, I can't remember, and we can't go into the exact details of the problem, but effectively what happened in this problem is that we were comparing two political parties. Political Party A, during their tenure in power, the unemployment rate was higher than, I don't know, we'll call it 10%, right? So the unemployment rate, or not only the unemployment rate, actually, and so here we're already going into the problem with percentages. The amount of people who are unemployed increased by some number greater than 10%. We'll just call it 10%. And so we're saying, all right, well, interesting, that's not so good. You don't want 10% more unemployed people. And then the new party came into power, or we'll call it Political Party B. And the number of people who are unemployed increased by less than 10%. And so the argument went that, wow, under the tenure or the reign, if you will, of Party B, there were less people unemployed than under the reign of Party A. Now, the issue with that is that actually the number of unemployed people kept increasing.
Absolutely.
It's just the amount that it increased by was less under Party B. But nevertheless, that still means that there's more unemployed people under the reign of Party B.
And that's super tricky, like that's one of those things that if I read Political Party A, increased unemployment by 12%, Political Party B came after that and increased unemployment, it went down, right? It increased by less than 10%. I want to say that there are fewer unemployed people now, but you can't, right? That's not how these proportions work out. And I think an easy way to visualize this, or at least what I do when I'm thinking about proportions and rates of change, is kind of like a water hose. Like there's water coming out of a water hose. If you decrease, if I step on the water hose, like in the middle, there's going to be less water coming out. But there's still water coming out of the water hose. It's just coming out at a slower rate. Same thing here, right? Unemployment is increasing, right? There are still more people that are unemployed now than before, just at a lower rate. The water's coming out at a lower rate. So whenever you're thinking about proportions, whatever kind of anchor statement that you use to remember what that relationship means, that's fine, as long as you're able to kind of keep it straight. Because those numbers, those proportions, those percentages especially, have a tendency to make what would otherwise be a relatively simple argument, right? Like maybe a 2 or 3 star question will almost immediately become a 5-star question because a lot of people get tripped up with these kind of proportions.
Yeah, for sure. I've got a great video about proportions here.
What is the video?
It's of someone making a bad argument.
Can you just tell me the argument?
No. So give this here. Watch this. Check this out.
I would argue anything we're putting into the ocean that is manufactured is not good for the ocean.
I agree. If I throw this away right now, is there a good chance it'll end up in the ocean?
Yes.
Really? American trash is what's ending up in the ocean?
Globally.
Really? Okay, so there's pretty good studies on this that would say that in the Pacific Ocean trash, and plastic specifically, the vast majority of it, over 90%, comes from Asia, African countries. Is that not true?
I think the numbers do tend to show that sort of increase on the part of the Asian countries, but that doesn't mean that we're not contributing to part of that as well.
How much do we contribute?
I don't have the answer at the top of my head.
It's like less than 1%, isn't it?
I don't know.
Did you catch what happened there, Aastha?
I did catch what happened there. A fun little game of proportions.
Yeah, a fun little game of proportions, or really of incorrect percentages.
Yeah.
In that situation, Dan Crawford, he's rebutting the idea that there's a good chance that American trash ends up in the ocean. And the reason why is that such a small percentage of trash, or at least in the Pacific, is from America. Apparently the vast majority of it is from Asia. Let's just assume all of those facts let's just assume that it is true, that a vast majority of the trash is from Asia and the Pacific Ocean. It could be something like 99%. Let's say 99% of the trash in the Pacific is from Asia. It nevertheless could be true that 100% of American trash also ends up in the Pacific. Because the issue is we just don't know how much trash America actually produces versus how much trash, Asia produces. This is not me dunking on any particular country, too. This is a merely hypothetical.
But yeah, right, the 10% that America produces in the oceans could be 100% of America's trash, right? All of our trash could make up that 10%.
Mm-hmm. And so, barring the, whatever argument you may land on, at the very least, Mr. Crawford or Congressman Crawford's conclusion that there is a low chance that a water bottle from America ends up in the ocean, that's not a valid argument. That is not an argument that you're able to make. It's actually, besides valid, it's not even a strong argument at all. Regardless of the validity, it's just a very poor argument here.
Yeah.
And so it just goes to show that how proportions, percentages end up being incredibly difficult to manage, even for, the highest echelons of power, of American power.
Congress
if you
people?
will. Congress people. I mean, you're pretty up there if you're a congressperson.
Fair.
Are you not?
Fair enough. That's fair. I mean, I agree, though, right? This is complicated
Second
for
only to LSAT tutors.
people who are studying for the LSAT in the real world. And I also think it's good practice, right? If you're studying for the LSAT and you're hearing these arguments being made in the real world on the news, people you talk to, if you can identify these flaws there, it's going to be a lot easier for you to identify them when you actually get to an LR question, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Exactly.
So let's move on to
All
the
right.
next thing that you wanted to talk about today, economics, supply and demand. What's going on there?
Yeah, there's a couple ideas in economics that I just think are useful to know about, mostly because they get referenced to. Right, so if you have just a cursory understanding of the concepts of supply and demand, and this idea of like taxes, you're going to be in a much better place. So the concept of taxes, right, comes up a decent amount of the time. And just one thing that I think is important to be aware of is this idea of like tariffs. Right? Have you heard of a tariff? Do you know what a tariff is?
Yeah, like a tax on goods coming in or out.
Yeah. Tariffs are taxes on imports, right? So when you're importing something into your country, you might put a tariff on it, right? So it's a form of protectionism. Not really that important whether you know the protectionist angle, but the idea is a tariff is just a tax, right? I feel like I see the word tariff all the time on LR. Maybe it's because I'm looking at the same set of problems.
It does come up. It does come up.
Yeah, without fail, someone ends up asking, like, what is a tariff, right? It's a tax on imports or exports, so the goods coming in and the goods going out. So if you're just aware of that, you're in a good spot. In terms of supply and demand, you don't have to know too much about economics, but you do have to understand, it is very useful to understand this concept of supply and demand. Right? Supply is the amount of goods that are available, and demand is the amount of people that want to purchase such good. And the idea, and so let's say, the supply of Coca-Cola. The idea of supply of Coca-Cola, right, it's just the amount of Coca-Cola that's available. Right? And the demand is how many people want to buy Coca-Cola. And where those two lines intersect is where the price comes about. Now, you don't have to understand this concept of pricing, but what you do have to understand is this concept that as demand increases, so too does the price. Right? So all things being equal, if I go from, 10 people wanting Coca-Cola to 100 people wanting Coca-Cola, what that's going to do to the demand is it's going to increase the amount of demand, right? And as the demand increases, the amount of money it takes to buy Coke also increases, right? Because before, like, let's say there's only one person who wants to buy a Coke, and you're selling that Coke for $5. You're the Coke salesperson. So I'll come up with, hey, I'll offer you $5 for the Coke. You say, okay, good. That's a fair transaction. Well, let's say we start adding a couple other people into this mix. Maybe it's me and John over there who wants to buy that Coke.
Okay.
And I offer you $5. And John says, hey, look, I also will offer you $5 for that Coke. Well, you also, what are you going to do there?
I'm going to raise the price of the Coke. I'm going to make some more money off of it.
Yeah, you're going to raise the price of the Coke a little bit because you know that both of us are willing to pay. So maybe you make it $6. And then I say, well, never mind. $5 for a Coke. I mean, it's crazy already. But, $5 for a Coke, it's a little too far for me. And John's like, all right, you know what? I'd love to buy that Coke. And so the idea is that as demand increases, so too does the price. This is something that you want to just be aware of. And a similar concept applies to supply, but the reverse. Right? As you increase the number of Cokes available, you're going to decrease the price. And so in our example, let's say you're selling Coke for $6. Another person comes in, Tiffany. Tiffany also wants to sell her Coke.
Where are these names coming from?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. Tiffany.
Right, like I guess Tiffany comes in, right? Tiffany comes in. She also wants to sell her Coke. She notices that you're selling your Cokes for something like $6. And so what she's going to say is, well, hey, look, maybe I could sell my Coke for $6, but Aastha's getting all the business. Maybe I could sell it for $5.50.
Okay.
Right, $5.50, and then people start buying Coke from her. And then you say, well, maybe I can decrease my price. Right? It only costs me $4 to buy Coke. So then you undercut her. Right? So as you increase the amount of people who are supplying Coke, and then the price is also going to come down until you hit the equilibrium, which is, the cost of production. It's in theory what the price should be. That is all you need to know, right? As demand increases, so does the price. As supply increases, the price goes down. You just need to understand those concepts on this test.
Could you give
anything
us
more than that is a wash.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that is kind of the underlying concept there. Could you give us an example of a type of LR question or a type of argument where this kind of becomes relevant?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, LR questions that talk about, so there's a couple economic questions that talk about gross domestic product per capita. Right? That's more on the ratio end. A lot of trap answer choices deal with supply and demand. I think there's something about coffee, the cost of producing coffee, and how why decaf coffee is much more expensive. And then there is something about the supply and the demand in there.
Yeah.
If you're confused about supply and demand, you might be like, oh, this is economic. This is like an economic principle. I should pick it.
It's got all the right
no, don't do
buzzwords that seem similar.
Yeah, right. They're talking about supply, demand. We're talking about prices. Henry told me to pick it, so I'm going to go for it. The answer is you don't want to. One, don't do that. Two, the reason you're thinking about supply and demand is mostly so you can get a handle on the stimulus itself rather than the actual answer choices. You want to be aware when they're saying, oh, we've increased the supply of baby formula. Right. In theory, what should that do? What does that mean if you've increased the supply of baby formula? It's an economic term. It just means that there's more baby formula available, right? Or the demand for baby formula has increased. It just means that there's more people who want to buy baby formula. Right? When they use those words, that's what they mean. So when you have a stimulus that talks about how the demand has increased for baby formula, all that means is that there's a lot more people who want to buy it.
Yeah.
Right? Or you say there's a lot more supply. There's a lot more people who are willing to sell it.
And I think that's really helpful to kind of be able to substitute in when you're seeing these terms and you don't really know how they apply to the topic that you're actually working with. If you can substitute in what it actually means, you can understand the argument a lot better. I think that's really helpful.
Yeah. I mean, and there are some other fringe economic concepts that come up. I won't say fringe. They're not fringe in economics, but they're fringe on the LSAT that it's helpful to know, but you don't need to know it. Whereas things like supply and demand and tariffs, it just comes up a lot. I don't know why. So taxes too.
It's helpful. It's helpful to know. And again, by no means do you need to go get an economics degree or go take an economics class thinking it's going to help you with the LSAT, because what Henry just told you is pretty much the extent of what you need to be able to understand, right? What supply is, what demand is, what a percentage is. That's about it. And if you can just kind of get familiar with those concepts and be able to manipulate them to whatever argument you're talking about, whatever types of numbers you're talking about, you're going to be on the right track. So I think that brings us to the end, for today at least.
Yeah, that brings us to the end.
I hope you enjoyed your lesson in math and economics.
Mostly on math. I think that is the most important thing. Percentages are, unlike economics where you don't have to do much with it, it's more just helpful to understand the terms. Percentages you do have to know. Right?
You have to be able to manipulate it, Yeah,
it's not really an option. It's just a good thing to do for life.
to be able to call out congressmen who make bad arguments. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, yeah, but just in general, I mean, life is chock full of proportions and percentages. So, in any case, I'm sure the demand for this episode is withering. So we'll cut off the supply right now. I hope you guys have a great week. We'll see you guys next week.
Nope, pause. Before we close it out, we wanted to throw out there that if you're interested in learning more about the LSAT, you have all of our episodes. You can continue to listen to the 7Sage LSAT podcast. However, we also have an admissions podcast. We did an episode with Jacob a couple weeks ago talking about his side of things. But if you want to learn more about admissions, feel free to go check out the admissions podcast. You can find it
ultimately
wherever you listen to this one.
The LSAT is just a means to an end.
And we got you covered with the next step. But
most things are means to some end. Let's be real here.
We're moving on. And the demand
we can reduce it all.
is going down.
Like it.
It's over.
Okay.
Episode done.
Aastha hates it. Done.